By the third song, even the servants had stopped pretending Evelyn Carter existed. The chandeliers of Blackthorn Hall shimmered like captured starlight above hundreds of dancing wolves, their crystal reflections sliding across polished marble floors as violins carried the final notes of another waltz through the royal ballroom. Silver drapes hung from 40-foot ceilings. Moon lilies filled the air with a sweet, cold fragrance. Everywhere Evelyn looked, women in glittering gowns spun beneath the lights while powerful alphas guided them across the dance floor with easy confidence. Laughter echoed through the hall like music of its own, but no one stood beside her. Evelyn kept her back against the farthest marble pillar she could find, fingers tightening around the folds of her pale blue dress. The fabric had belonged to her mother once, altered and resewn so many times the lace at the sleeves no longer matched. It wasn't ugly. It was simply forgettable, just like her. Another song began. Couples immediately moved toward the ballroom floor, while servants rushed between tables carrying silver trays filled with sparkling drinks and sugared fruit. Evelyn lowered her gaze before anyone could meet it. She already knew what they would see. The rejected Omega. The girl no alpha wanted. Still waiting for a miracle? One woman whispered nearby, her voice soft enough to sound polite and sharp enough to cut anyway. Quiet laughter followed. Evelyn pretended not to hear it. She had spent the last 3 years pretending not to hear things. Ever since the rejection ceremony that shattered what remained of her family's reputation, silence had become survival. A rejected Omega wasn't dangerous. She wasn't scandalous. She was simply embarrassing. Invisible when convenient. Mocked when entertaining. Her stepmother had almost forbidden her from attending the Moonfall Ball tonight altogether. Almost. But someone had needed to help carry shawls, fetch drinks, and stand quietly behind her stepsisters while they paraded themselves before the most powerful wolves in the kingdom. Smile more, her stepmother had hissed earlier inside the carriage. You already look pitiful enough. Without sulking, Evelyn had smiled then. She had learned how to do that too. Across the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted as another pair finished dancing. Evelyn glanced up instinctively and immediately regretted it. Her younger stepsister, Clara, stood near the center of the room wrapped in layers of silver silk, while 2 young alphas competed for her attention. Clara laughed beautifully, effortlessly. Everything about her seemed effortless. Beauty, popularity, desire. The things Evelyn once thought might happen naturally someday before fate decided otherwise. Poor thing. Another voice murmured behind her. No one's asked her all night. Would you? Absolutely not. Rejection stains spread. More laughter. Evelyn swallowed carefully and looked back toward the windows instead. Beyond the towering glass panes, the kingdom stretched beneath the midnight sky in waves of silver snow and dark pine forests. The moon hung enormous above the mountains, glowing so brightly it painted the ballroom floor in pale blue light. Somewhere beyond those forests stood the Blackthorn Citadel towers where the Alpha King ruled with a reputation sharp enough to silence entire rooms. King Lucian Blackthorn rarely attended royal celebrations personally. When he did, every noble family treated the event like war disguised as elegance. Every daughter hoped to be noticed. Every alpha hoped to impress him. Every conversation somehow circled back to him eventually. Evelyn exhaled slowly, trying not to think about any of it. She only needed to survive a few more hours. Then she could return home and disappear again where people expected her to belong. Another dance was announced. Another wave of couples crossed the ballroom floor. And still no one approached the girl standing alone beside the pillar while moonlight spilled quietly across her forgotten dress. The 4th song ended beneath a wave of polite applause, and Evelyn realized something worse than being laughed at was beginning to happen. People were forgetting she was there at all. The ballroom flowed around her like a river curving around stone. Nobles passed within inches of her without meeting her eyes. Servants carrying silver trays brushed by her shoulder without apology. Even the musicians seemed farther away now, their violins dissolving into the soft roar of conversation and crystal glasses clinking beneath the chandeliers. Evelyn folded her hands tightly in front of her stomach, forcing herself to remain still. She had learned long ago that humiliation became sharper the moment people saw it on your face. There you are. Her stepmother's voice slid beside her like cold smoke. Evelyn straightened immediately. Margaret Carter approached in deep emerald silk, every inch of her perfectly arranged from the diamonds at her throat to the sharp smile resting on painted lips. Clara lingered behind her, glowing beneath layers of silver fabric while two admirers hovered nearby. Honestly, Margaret muttered quietly, adjusting one of Clara's sleeves. You stand in corners so naturally it is almost impressive. Evelyn lowered her eyes. I was staying out of the way. Good. Continue doing that. Margaret finally looked at her directly, and disappointment flickered across her face like a reflex she could no longer control. King Lucian arrived 20 minutes ago. Do you understand what tonight means for this family? Evelyn nodded softly. Yes. Then stop looking miserable. If anyone asks, you are simply shy, not rejected. The word landed carefully between them anyway. Rejected. It followed Evelyn everywhere now. Not shouted. Not whispered. Simply understood. In wolf society, rejection carried a kind of invisible stain no expensive gown could hide. Alphas avoided it instinctively. Omegas pitted it quietly. And noble families feared it more than scandal itself because rejection suggested weakness in the bloodline. Margaret's attention shifted the moment another noblewoman approached. Lady Carter. The woman greeted warmly before glancing at Evelyn. Her smile faded just slightly. Oh, I did not realize your older daughter attended tonight. Older daughter. Not Evelyn. Never Evelyn. She insisted, Margaret replied smoothly. Clara hid a smile behind her glass. The woman's gaze lingered on Evelyn's dress. Well, it is brave of her to show herself after what happened. Evelyn felt heat rise painfully into her face. She stared at the marble floor instead, counting the veins in the stone the way she sometimes counted breaths when anxiety pressed too tightly against her ribs. 1, 2, 3. I heard her former mate move to the Western Territories. The woman continued casually. Married already, I believe. Last winter, Margaret answered. A beta from Silver Creek. How fortunate for him. Soft laughter followed. Evelyn's chest tightened, but she kept her expression calm. That was the cruelest part about these gatherings. No one needed to openly insult her. Their pity worked just as well. A server passed carrying glasses filled with sparkling gold wine, and Margaret immediately turned away from Evelyn as though embarrassed to remain beside her any longer. Stay near the wall, she instructed quietly before leaving with Clara. And do not draw attention to yourself. Evelyn watched them disappear into the crowd beneath the chandeliers. Around the ballroom, couples drifted across the dance floor while moonlight spilled through towering windows in pale silver ribbons. Somewhere near the royal staircase, a burst of feminine laughter rose suddenly louder than the music. Evelyn glanced up before she could stop herself. Across the hall, surrounded by nobles dressed in black and silver, stood King Lucian Blackthorn. Tall, motionless, untouchable. Even from nearly 50 feet away, his presence seemed to change the temperature of the room. Conversations softened around him instinctively. Powerful alphas lowered their eyes when he passed. Women smiled too quickly whenever he looked their way. Yet Lucian himself looked almost bored by all of it. Detached. Like a wolf standing among prey, he had no interest in chasing. Then, slowly, his silver gaze lifted from the crowd. And for one impossible second, it landed directly on Evelyn. The moment King Lucian Blackthorn looked at her, the noise inside the ballroom seemed to pull away like water retreating from shore. Evelyn stopped breathing for half a second. It was ridiculous, she told herself immediately. The Alpha King was not truly looking at her. Men like Lucian Blackthorn did not notice women, standing alone beside marble pillars in old dresses. They noticed power, beauty, influence, not rejected omegas pretending not to exist. Still, something in his expression held for one strange heartbeat longer than it should have. Then a nobleman stepped in front of him, blocking the view completely, and the spell shattered. Conversation rushed back into the room. Music returned. Evelyn released the breath she had not realized she was holding and lowered her eyes again, embarrassed by her own thoughts. Do not stare at him too long. The voice came softly beside her. Evelyn turned to find an older servant arranging fresh moon lilies near the windows. The woman smiled kindly without looking up from her work. Women have started wars over less tonight. Evelyn managed a faint smile. I was not staring. Of course not. The servant adjusted another flower carefully. Still, you should know this is the first moonfall ball His Majesty has attended in almost 4 years. Evelyn glanced toward the royal staircase again before she could stop herself. Lucian stood surrounded by nobles now, though somehow he still looked entirely alone. Tall men who commanded entire territories seemed smaller beside him. His black formal coat fit broad shoulders with sharp, effortless precision, silver embroidery catching the chandelier light whenever he moved. Dark hair brushed the collar of his coat. His expression remained unreadable. Cold, some people would call it. But Evelyn thought he looked tired more than cruel, like someone carrying too much silence inside him. They say he never dances, the servant continued quietly. Not since becoming king. Evelyn looked back at her. Why? The woman shrugged lightly. Some say he does not trust anyone close enough. Others say the moon goddess never intended him to have a mate. Evelyn's chest tightened unexpectedly at the thought. Wolves whispered many things about Lucian Blackthorn. That he ended disputes with a single look. That rival alphas feared him more than open war. That he ruled the northern territories with absolute control despite still being younger than most kings before him. But beneath every rumor lived another quieter one. Alone. The musicians shifted into a slower melody, violins soft and aching beneath the chandeliers. Across the ballroom, another line of couples moved toward the dance floor while noble daughters angled themselves closer to the royal staircase, hoping for even a moment of the king's attention. Clara was among them now, her silver gown glowing beneath candlelight as she laughed too brightly beside a dark-haired alpha from the Eastern Territories. Margaret hovered nearby like a strategist watching battle lines form. Evelyn wondered if her stepmother had already imagined Clara wearing a crown. Lady Evelyn. She blinked in surprise as a young servant approached carrying a tray of crystal glasses. Your stepmother asked that you deliver these to the upper balcony. Evelyn nodded immediately. Of course. Anything useful was better than standing forgotten against walls all night. She carefully lifted the silver tray into her hands and began weaving through the crowded ballroom. The glasses trembled slightly as she walked, not because they were heavy but because hundreds of conversations pressed against her senses all at once. Laughter, pride, jealousy, desire. Wolves carried emotion differently than humans. Stronger, sharper. Even after years of rejection, Evelyn still felt overwhelmed in rooms like this. She kept her focus forward, moving carefully between dancers beneath the massive chandeliers. Then suddenly the crowd shifted near the center of the hall. Several nobles stepped aside at once. And before Evelyn could react, she found herself standing only a few feet away from King Lucian Blackthorn himself. The silver tray nearly slipped from Evelyn's hands when she realized how close she was standing to the Alpha King. Less than 6 feet separated them now. Close enough for her to see the faint scar near the edge of his jaw. Close enough to notice that his silver eyes were even colder up close. Not empty exactly, but guarded in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Wolves moved carefully around him, instinctively leaving space wherever he stood. Even laughter sounded quieter near him. Evelyn lowered her gaze immediately and stepped sideways, hoping to disappear back into the crowd before drawing attention to herself. Easy there. A masculine voice stopped her before she could escape. Evelyn looked up and found a young alpha smiling at her from a few feet away. He was handsome in the polished way noblemen often were, with neatly styled blonde hair and a velvet midnight blue coat trimmed in gold. She recognized him vaguely as Daniel Mercer, the son of a wealthy Eastern pack leader. His smile widened slightly when she met his eyes. You looked ready to flee the kingdom. A few nearby nobles chuckled softly. Evelyn forced a polite expression. I was only delivering drinks. Daniel glanced at the tray in her hands. Then perhaps you deserve a break. He extended one hand dramatically toward her. Dance with me. Silence flickered through the small circle surrounding them. Evelyn froze. Not because she believed the invitation was sincere, but because she suddenly understood exactly what was happening. Nearby, Clara looked over from the staircase with immediate interest. Margaret Carter's lips curved faintly at the corners. Several women exchanged knowing glances behind jeweled fans. Evelyn's stomach twisted painfully. Daniel Mercer was not offering kindness. He was offering entertainment. I should continue working, Evelyn said quietly. Nonsense. Daniel stepped closer, still smiling for the audience gathering around them. It is moonfall. Even lonely girls deserve one dance. More laughter. Softer this time. Sharper. Evelyn could already feel the trap tightening around her. If she refused, they would call her bitter. If she accepted, they would enjoy watching her fail. But dozens of eyes were already on her now, including members of the royal court. There was no graceful escape left. "All right," she whispered finally. Daniel took the tray from her hands and passed it carelessly to a servant before leading her toward the ballroom floor. Music swelled around them as couples shifted aside to make room. Evelyn became painfully aware of every movement she made, every step, every breath. The entire ballroom seemed to watch with quiet anticipation. Daniel placed one hand lightly near hers as the dance began, but his attention never truly settled on her. He kept glancing toward the crowd instead, feeding on their reactions. "Relax," he murmured with amusement. "You look terrified." Evelyn kept her eyes lowered. "Please do not do this." "Do what?" His grin sharpened slightly. "Be charitable." Heat rushed into her cheeks. Around them, whispers drifted through the music. "Rejected Omega. Poor thing." Someone finally asked her. She should be grateful. Evelyn focused desperately on the rhythm of the violins, trying not to hear any of it. For one fragile moment, she almost believed the humiliation might stay small enough to survive quietly. Then Daniel suddenly released her hand mid-step. Evelyn stumbled slightly as he stepped backward with exaggerated surprise. "Oh," he said loudly enough for nearby couples to hear. "Careful. I nearly forgot." Laughter burst instantly through the surrounding crowd. Daniel smiled apologetically, though there was no apology in his eyes at all. "I promised my next dance already." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the center of the ballroom while hundreds of eyes fixed on her at once. The music continued for 2 unbearable seconds longer. Then, slowly it stopped. The silence after the music stopped felt louder than the laughter had. Evelyn stood frozen beneath the chandeliers while dozens of nobles stared openly now, no longer bothering to hide their amusement behind careful smiles or jeweled fans. Heat climbed painfully into her face. Her hands trembled at her sides, and for one horrible second, she thought she might actually cry in front of all of them. "Not here. Please not here." Daniel Mercer disappeared into the crowd without a trace of guilt, already accepting another dance from a beautiful brunette near the staircase, while scattered laughter continued to ripple across the ballroom. "That was cruel," someone whispered. "Cruel," another voice replied softly. "It was funny." Evelyn swallowed hard and forced herself to breathe evenly. All she needed to do was walk away, quietly. If she could make it back to the edges of the room, perhaps the humiliation would fade into the noise of the evening soon. Enough. But her legs refused to move. Hundreds of eyes pressed against her skin like cold rain. Clara stood near the staircase with one hand covering her smile, though she made no effort to hide the satisfaction shining in her expression. Margaret Carter looked annoyed more than sympathetic, as though Evelyn had somehow embarrassed the family simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Somewhere near the orchestra platform, one of the violinists shifted nervously, uncertain whether to continue playing. Evelyn lowered her head, wishing with sudden desperation that the marble floor would open beneath her feet and swallow her whole. Then a sound echoed through the ballroom. A glass being set down. Sharp. Precise. Every conversation nearby stopped immediately. Evelyn looked up before she could stop herself. Across the hall, King Lucian Blackthorn had risen from his seat. The entire ballroom seemed to change around him instantly. Powerful alphas who moments ago had been laughing now straightened instinctively. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the servants froze where they stood. Lucian adjusted the cuff of his black coat once with calm, unhurried movements before stepping away from the royal table. And then he began walking. Not toward the staircase. Not toward the noble daughters waiting hopefully nearby. Toward her. The crowd parted automatically before him like water moving around stone. No one spoke. No one dared block his path. His footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor beneath the chandeliers, while silver moonlight spilled through the towering windows behind him. Evelyn's heartbeat became painfully uneven. This could not be happening. It made no sense. She glanced behind herself once as though he might be approaching someone else entirely, but there was no one there. Only the empty stretch of ballroom wall where she had spent most of the evening trying to disappear. Lucian kept walking. Steady. Certain. Every pair of eyes in Blackthorn Hall followed him now. Evelyn could feel the shift in the room spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Confusion, shock, curiosity, fear. Noble women who had spent the entire evening trying to catch. The king's attention stared in disbelief as he crossed directly past them without so much as a glance. Clara's smile vanished completely. Margaret Carter looked suddenly pale. Lucian stopped only inches in front of Evelyn at the exact center of the silent ballroom. Up close, his presence felt overwhelming in a way she could not explain. Not threatening. Worse. Intense. Like standing too close to something powerful enough to change your life accidentally. Evelyn struggled to breathe beneath the weight of his silver gaze. The Alpha King looked down at her quietly for one long heartbeat. Then, slowly, he removed his black gloves one finger at a time. The sound of Lucian Blackthorn removing his gloves seemed impossibly loud inside the silent ballroom. Evelyn could not look away from his hands. Strong, steady, completely unshaken, while her own pulse stumbled wildly against her ribs. No one moved around them. Nobles stood frozen beneath the chandeliers as though afraid even breathing too loudly might interrupt whatever was happening in front of them. Lucian folded the gloves once and handed them calmly to a nearby servant without taking his eyes off Evelyn. His silver gaze held hers with quiet intensity, not cruel, not mocking, simply certain in a way she had never experienced before. Evelyn suddenly became painfully aware of everything about herself. The loose strand of pale blonde hair falling near her shoulder. The old lace sleeves of her dress. The humiliation still burning hot beneath her skin from Daniel Mercer abandoning her moments earlier. "Your Majesty," she whispered finally, her voice almost disappearing beneath the silence surrounding them. Lucian tilted his head slightly, as though studying something no one else in the ballroom could see. Evelyn Carter. Hearing her name in his voice made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Deep. Calm. Controlled. She could not remember the last time anyone had spoken her name without pity hidden somewhere beneath it. Around them, whispers immediately broke through the crowd again. He knows her name. How? Since when? Evelyn's throat tightened. I should leave the floor. Lucian's expression did not change. Why? The question caught her off guard. Because everyone is staring, she wanted to say. Because this is humiliating. Because kings do not stand in the middle of royal ballrooms speaking to rejected omegas while half the kingdom watches in shock. Instead, she lowered her eyes. I do not belong here. A strange stillness crossed Lucian's face then. Not anger. Something quieter. Colder. Who told you that? Evelyn blinked softly, startled by the question. Before she could answer, Lucian extended one bare hand toward her. The movement was simple, effortless. Yet the entire ballroom reacted as though lightning had struck through the center of Blackthorn Hall. Noble women stared openly now. Several alphas looked genuinely unsettled. Margaret Carter nearly dropped the glass in her hand. Evelyn looked down at the offered hand in disbelief. Her heart beat so hard it almost hurt. Dance with me, Lucian said quietly. No one in the ballroom breathed. Evelyn stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. The Alpha King never danced. Everyone knew that. Stories about it had spread across the northern territories for years. Noble daughters spent entire seasons hoping to become the first woman he would choose. Yet he stood here now asking her. The rejected Omega abandoned in the middle of the dance floor barely 2 minutes earlier. Your Majesty. Her voice shook despite every effort to steady it. People are watching. I am aware. There was the faintest trace of dry amusement in his tone now, though his expression remained unreadable. Evelyn glanced helplessly toward the crowd surrounding them. Clara looked stunned. Daniel Mercer had gone visibly pale near the orchestra platform. Even the musicians seemed frozen in place, waiting for permission to move again. This cannot be real, Evelyn thought desperately. None of this felt real anymore. Lucian's hand remained extended between them, unwavering, patient, like he already knew she would take it eventually. And somehow that certainty frightened her more than anything else tonight. You do not have to be afraid of me, he said softly enough that only she could hear. The words broke something fragile inside her chest. Not because they were romantic, not because they were kind, but because no one had noticed she was afraid in a very long time. Evelyn slowly lifted her trembling hand toward his. The moment her fingers touched his palm, warmth rushed sharply through her entire body like sudden sunlight after endless winter. She gasped quietly before she could stop herself. Lucian's silver eyes darkened slightly in surprise. Around them, the chandeliers overhead flickered once. The chandelier lights flickered again the instant Evelyn's hand settled fully into Lucian Blackthorn's. A soft gasp moved through the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Evelyn felt the warmth rush farther this time. Not painful, not frightening, but powerful enough to steal the air from her lungs. It spread from her fingertips up her arm and straight into her chest, where something deep inside her seemed to wake suddenly after years of silence. Lucian's expression changed almost imperceptibly. For the first time that night, the Alpha King looked genuinely caught off guard. His silver eyes sharpened on her face as though he were hearing a distant sound no one else could detect. Around them, crystal glasses trembled faintly against silver trays. The musicians exchanged nervous looks near the orchestra platform. Somewhere high above the ballroom, one of the massive chandeliers dimmed and brightened again in a pulse that matched the uneven rhythm hammering inside Evelyn's chest. "Your Majesty," an older nobleman whispered from the edge of the crowd, his voice strained with confusion. Lucian ignored him completely. His attention never left Evelyn. Slowly, carefully, he closed his hand around hers. The warmth deepened instantly. Evelyn inhaled sharply. Memories flashed through her mind without warning. Moonlight spilling across snow. A voice she did not recognize calling her name somewhere far away. Silver eyes watching her through darkness long before tonight. She blinked hard, disoriented. "What is happening to me?" Lucian stepped closer, one hand settling lightly at her waist as the musicians hurriedly began playing again, desperate to break the suffocating silence hanging over the ballroom. The moment the music returned, he guided her gently into motion. Evelyn barely remembered how to breathe, much less dance. "Relax," Lucian said quietly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You are trembling. I do not understand any of this." Her confession escaped before she could stop it. Lucian studied her face for one long moment. "Neither do I." The honesty in his answer startled her more than anything else tonight. Kings were supposed to sound certain, untouchable. But beneath Lucian's calm exterior, Evelyn sensed something tightly restrained shifting beneath the surface. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The ballroom slowly blurred around them as he guided her across the marble floor beneath the chandeliers. Noble couples instinctively moved aside whenever they approached, creating space around them like an invisible current none of the other wolves dared cross. Evelyn could feel eyes following every movement they made. Shock, jealousy, confusion. Yet for the first time all night, those emotions no longer crushed her beneath their weight. Because Lucian remained beside her through all of it. His hand never loosened around hers. "Look at the chandeliers," a woman whispered somewhere nearby. Evelyn glanced upward instinctively. Soft silver light shimmered through the crystals overhead now, brighter than before, casting moonlit reflections across the ballroom floor. The Moonfall Ball was built around ancient traditions older than most kingdoms. Wolves believed the moon goddess occasionally revealed signs during sacred gatherings when fate shifted course. Most signs were small, barely noticeable, a candle refusing to extinguish, snow falling beneath a clear sky. But this felt different. Near the orchestra platform, one elderly councilwoman suddenly stood from her chair, so quickly it nearly toppled backward. Her eyes fixed on Evelyn with open disbelief. "The bond," she whispered hoarsely. "Impossible." More whispers spread instantly through the crowd. "Bond. Fated. Moon chosen." Evelyn's stomach tightened painfully. No, that could not be true. Not for her. Rejected Omegas did not become destiny. They became cautionary tales whispered behind jeweled fans. Lucian must have sensed her panic because his hold on her tightened slightly. Steadying. Protective. "Do not listen to them," he murmured softly. Evelyn looked up at him then, truly looked at him, and something inside her chest ached unexpectedly at the expression in his eyes. Not pity. Never pity. Wonder. Like after years of searching through endless darkness, he had suddenly found something he thought no longer existed. And for the first time in years, Evelyn no longer felt invisible. The dance ended beneath absolute silence. Not polite silence. Not the quiet murmur of impressed nobles after a performance. This was something heavier. The kind of silence that settled over a room the moment history changed in front of too many witnesses. Lucian Blackthorn stopped moving only when the final violin note faded into the towering ceilings of Blackthorn Hall. His hand still rested lightly against Evelyn's waist, warm and steady through the thin fabric of her dress. Neither of them stepped apart immediately. Evelyn could still feel traces of that strange heat beneath her skin, pulsing softly every time their eyes met. Around them, the ballroom remained frozen in disbelief. Then Daniel Mercer laughed nervously somewhere near the orchestra platform. The sound broke the spell instantly. "Surely this is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, though his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier. "Your Majesty was only being generous." Lucian slowly turned his head toward him. The movement alone silenced half the ballroom again. Daniel visibly stiffened beneath the king's gaze. For the first time that evening, Evelyn saw genuine fear flicker across the young alpha's face. Lucian released Evelyn carefully before taking one slow step forward. Not aggressive. Calm. Somehow that made it worse. "Generous," Lucian repeated quietly. His voice carried easily through the silent ballroom without needing volume. "Is that how you describe humiliating a woman in front of half the kingdom?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty." "No." Lucian's silver eyes sharpened slightly. "Then perhaps you should explain why Miss Carter was left standing alone in the center of the ballroom while you entertained your friends." No one moved. Even Margaret Carter looked unable to speak now. Daniel opened his mouth once before closing it again. He had no answer that could survive the weight of the Alpha King's attention. Lucian glanced briefly around the ballroom then, his expression growing colder with every face he passed. "Interesting," he said softly. "A room filled with noble wolves. Yet not one of you thought to stop it." Shame moved visibly through parts of the crowd. Several nobles lowered their eyes immediately. Others remained rigidly silent, unwilling to draw attention to themselves now that the king's mood had shifted. Evelyn's heart pounded painfully in her chest. None of this felt real. She stood rooted beside the center of the ballroom floor, while the most powerful man in the Northern Territories defended her publicly as though her dignity actually mattered. As though she mattered. Clara finally stepped forward from the staircase, forcing a delicate smile back onto her face. "Your Majesty," she said carefully. Surely everyone was only enjoying harmless fun. Lucian looked at her once. That was all. Yet Clara's smile vanished almost instantly beneath the weight of his expression. "Cruelty becomes harmless only to those never forced to endure it," Lucian replied calmly. The words struck the ballroom harder than shouting ever could have. Evelyn felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. No one had ever spoken for her like this before. Not publicly. Not without embarrassment attached somewhere beneath the kindness. Lucian turned back toward her then, and the coldness in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He crossed the remaining distance between them before offering his arm with quiet certainty, as though there had never been any question she belonged beside him. "Miss Carter," he said clearly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "Would you accompany me for the remainder of the evening?" Shock rippled openly through the crowd now. Evelyn stared at him, unable to find words. Her entire life had taught her to shrink beneath attention, to apologize for existing too loudly. Yet Lucian stood before hundreds of nobles offering her something far more dangerous than kindness. Recognition. Slowly, trembling slightly, Evelyn placed her hand against his arm. The instant she did, whispers exploded through Blackthorn Hall once more. Future Queen. Moon chosen. Impossible. But Lucian did not react to any of it. He simply covered her hand gently with his own before leading her toward the royal balcony, while the same people who ignored her hours ago stepped aside to clear her path. Cold night air greeted Evelyn the moment Lucian guided her through the towering glass doors leading onto the royal balcony. The noise of Blackthorn Hall softened behind them instantly, fading into distant music and muffled conversation, while silver moonlight stretched across the snow-covered mountains beyond the citadel. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Evelyn stepped slowly toward the stone railing, her pulse finally beginning to steady after the impossible whirlwind of the last hour. Below the balcony, thousands of lanterns glowed throughout the capital like fallen stars scattered across the valley. Snow drifted gently through the dark sky in soft silver flakes. Beautiful, quiet, unreal. Lucian remained a few feet behind her at first, giving her space without truly letting distance settle between them. Evelyn wrapped her arms lightly around herself against the cold, though she barely felt the temperature anymore. Her thoughts moved too quickly. The ballroom, the whispers, the strange warmth when he touched her. The word bond echoing through Blackthorn Hall like something sacred and dangerous all at once. "You are overwhelmed," Lucian said quietly behind her. Evelyn let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That is one way to describe it. She turned slowly to face him again. Moonlight silvered the sharp lines of his face, softening some of the coldness people feared so much inside the ballroom. Out here, away from the crowd, he looked less like an untouchable king and more like a man carrying years of exhaustion behind careful control. "Why?" she asked softly before she could lose the courage. Lucian's expression shifted slightly. "Why what? Why me?" Her voice trembled despite every effort to steady it. There were hundreds of women in that ballroom tonight. Powerful women. Beautiful women. Women your court actually approves of. A faint shadow crossed Lucian's face at the last sentence. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. "I am not someone kings choose." Silence stretched between them for several heartbeats. Then Lucian stepped closer until only a small distance remained between them. "Evelyn." The way he said her name still unsettled something deep inside her chest. Gentle. Careful. As though it mattered. "Do you know what I felt the moment I walked into that ballroom tonight?" She shook her head slowly. Lucian's silver gaze held hers completely now. Relief. Evelyn blinked in confusion. Lucian glanced briefly toward the moonlit mountains before speaking again. "For years, I thought something was wrong with me." His voice remained calm, but she sensed how rare honesty was for him. Wolves speak about the mate bond as certainty. Immediate. Unmistakable. But I never felt anything close to it. Not once. Evelyn listened quietly, barely breathing. "Then tonight," Lucian continued softly, "I walked into Blackthorn Hall and felt my wolf become restless for the first time in my life." Her heart skipped painfully. "I kept searching the ballroom without understanding why." A faint smile touched his mouth then, small and almost disbelieving. "And every instinct I have led me to the woman standing alone beside the wall pretending she wished to disappear." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in Evelyn's throat. She looked away quickly toward the snow falling beyond the balcony, because suddenly she could not bear the way he was looking at her. Like she was something precious instead of embarrassing. "You do not know me," she whispered. Lucian stepped closer again. "I know enough." Evelyn slowly looked back up at him. The moonlight caught silver in his eyes as he lifted one hand carefully toward her face, giving her every chance to pull away. When his fingertips brushed gently against her cheek, warmth bloomed through her chest all over again. Soft, steady, real. "Before tonight," Lucian said quietly, "everyone in that ballroom saw a rejected Omega." His thumb brushed lightly beneath her eye. "I saw the woman fate try to hide from me." Evelyn's breath caught painfully. Snow drifted silently around the royal balcony, while distant music floated through the open ballroom doors behind them. And for the first time since her rejection ceremony shattered her life years ago, Evelyn Carter no longer felt like something broken beneath the moonlight.